see the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.
Hi, it's Edwin Rutsch from the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy, and today I'm here with Lynne Cameron. And Lynne is a professor of applied linguistics at the Open University. Thank you for joining me, Lynne, for this dialogue on how we can build a culture of empathy.
Well, thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, so I have all the different projects you're working on here up on my website. On my page here, it says your website is Living with Uncertainty, Metaphors and Dynamics of Empathy. And I'll just give a quick showing. I'll just show that on up here on the screen. And anyone can get to your website through this video if you just follow the links from this video. You also have a book, Metaphors and Reconciliation, the Discourse Dynamics of Empathy in Post-Conflict Conversations. Your blog is Empathy and Dyspathy in Action. Is that?
No, it's called the Empathy Blog.
Oh, Empathy Blog.
Yeah.
And that's on the WordPress. And you have numerous papers about empathy on your website, as well as it looks like you're doing a conference on June 11th and 12th this year, 2012, Researching Empathy, an academic conference, and empathy and dynamics, dialogue, and conflict. So you're really doing a lot of work around empathy.
That's right. I've had this 3-year project that's coming to a close now, and that's why the conferences are coming up to disseminate what we've been doing.
So can you tell me a little bit about your work and kind of how you got into it, and kind of maybe a little bit of an outline of what you're working on?
Yes, the current project's Living with Uncertainty, and I got into that through metaphor. I'm an applied linguist, which means I study how people use language, and I'm particularly interested in how people use metaphor in their language when they're talking with each other. And so I'd started years back looking at metaphor in classrooms and how teachers use metaphors talking with children. And then I was looking for a project that was something different. And I happened upon a documentary on the BBC of Jo Berry. And Jo was a young woman whose father was killed by an IRA bomb in 1984. And she's a remarkable person who decided she wanted to understand why Patrick McGee, who was a member of the IRA at the time, had planted the bomb. And so she'd arranged to meet him, and they had some conversations together. And I saw this documentary on the television and was amazed by the metaphors they were using all the way through. They were talking about building bridges to reconciliation and journeys of one sort or another. So I contacted Jo, and she kindly sent me some of their videos of their conversations. And so that became my research project into metaphor and reconciliation. And what I did there was to analyze the metaphors that the two of them used when they talked to each other. And that helped me to track through as they used language as a bridge. So they might bring a metaphor. Jo talked about healing and about a journey very early on, for example. But it took a while before Patrick McGee could use healing. That seemed to be Jo's metaphor. And so it was a significant moment in their dialogues when he began to use her metaphor. And the same worked the other way around. So that by tracking metaphors, I could see something as a process. And to describe that process, I needed the idea of empathy, that what they were doing was building an understanding of each other and getting into each other's mindsets, imagining how it was to be the other. And I worked on this for several years. I was very impressed by them as people and the effort they made to understand each other. And so out of that came my first model of empathy. And I was very aware of the dynamics. So how things changed. They changed minute by minute when they were face to face and talking to each other. But they also changed when they come back after 3 months and meet again, or over several years. And I've known them now for a long time, and they've gone through phases where they found it difficult to get on with each other, and then they perhaps go and do some peacemaking work together and find it much easier to get on. Sometimes they feel as if they have a kind of friendship. Sometimes it's not like that. And I wanted to track the dynamics of empathy and to think about empathy as something that's always changing rather than as a character trait or something fixed.
Yeah, so empathy is not like a switch then that you turn it on and off like a light switch, it's on or off. It seems to be constantly shifting and being in a kind of this dynamic quality, sounds like you're saying.
Yes, that's right. But it's also at the same time a characteristic of people. So each individual may come to a dialogue with different degrees of empathy. And that's a result of their childhood experiences. And as we know from neuroscience, it's also a matter of the way their brains work and so on. But the term empathy is used quite loosely for all these different types of processes on different timescales. So what I'm trying to do in the Uncertainty Project is bring all these together and to understand how empathy works minute by minute, but also hour by hour and year by year, and how it works across groups as well as individuals.
Yeah, I think somewhere, was it that, I guess that was someone else I was thinking. It's just that it looks like you're looking, yeah, I know, it was that you're looking at empathy from all different points of view, I think was something that your conference said. So it's a multi-facet, multi-dimensional kind of view, kind of more eclectic view.
Yes, but trying to be eclectic in a systematic way. So I'm trying to build a model that accounts for all these different types of empathy. And I've done that in this current project, the 3-year one, which is funded by the Economic and Social Research Council here in the UK. And I've been looking in different contexts, so 8 different situations, where uncertainty mostly comes from violence and conflict. And looking at how people talk about their experiences, and from that, trying to get a handle on what empathy means when people are talking to each other.
So it's I've been looking at empathy for a while now as well, and the academics, they don't agree on the definition of empathy. There's, I don't know if you know, Daniel Batson, I think it's in University of Kansas. He's kind of laid out 8 different ways that the word empathy is even used. So it sounds like you were trying to kind of come up with a unified definition or at least kind of show what these different definitions are.
Yeah, and see how they fit together. It may be that they won't, but so far they will fit together.
Well, maybe before we go into the actual definitions that you've come up with, may that be something to explore, is I love metaphor as well. And so it's great that you're a linguist studying metaphor. And I've been finding that framing the discussions about empathy, starting off with a couple of metaphors, is a nice way to actually frame the discussion. So, the empathy is often, commonly defined as standing in someone else's shoes, looking through someone else's eyes, and those are just metaphors. Seems to me, I guess you would be the expert here, but what is your personal metaphor of empathy? Like if you, create your own metaphor of what empathy is like, and you can't use the shoe one or the eye one, what is your own personal one? And I'll say for me, empathy is like a cornucopia.
Yeah. What I've decided to use is connection, that empathy is connecting with someone else. But then the type of connection, I like the metaphor that was used by Bakhtin, the Russian scholar. He talked about it as an entering into the other person's life. And you need the gesture that goes with entering into, and that this is an act of the imagination. Because the problem I have with the shoes metaphor is there are 2 ways to think about that. One is, what's it like for me to walk in someone else's shoes? So this is kind of self-focused empathy. But really what we want to get at is what's it like for the other person to walk in their shoes? And we can only imagine that from thinking of ourselves, of course. But that's where the entering into comes in.
So your metaphor is entering into someone else's life.
Yes, and then either into their world or into their mindset, or yeah.
And what would be the opposite of empathy then, and a metaphor for that?
The word I'm using for the opposite is dyspathy, and I'm glad you asked that, because if you ask for my one key finding from my 3 years of work, it would be you can't understand empathy without understanding its opposite or its complement. And what I've found is that people resist empathy, they avoid empathy, and I needed to name that in order to talk about it. So I'm using dyspathy, which is not a metaphor, I know, but that's a label. So, and what's come out of my work are two metaphors for that. One is distancing. And so people put the other person so far away they needn't be concerned with them. And the other is the idea of a barrier or a block. So it's as if the shutter comes down and the other person's on the other side and we no longer connect. So either distances or barriers or blocks.
Mm-hmm. So we have the metaphor, we have two worlds now. We have the world of being distant from someone and maybe some blocks between us and them. And then what we're wanting to do to create a culture of empathy, because that's what my interest is how do we actually transform society so that the level of empathy kind of goes up. And so you're saying then is the entering into the world and the experience of the other. So it's like closing the distance, removing the blocks, and kind of moving into their experience.
Yes. And one of the things that's coming out of my work is how threatened people feel by the other person coming too close very often. So it's a making safe as well. It's so important. We don't let people near without feeling safe. And also what I'm becoming very aware of, that rather than increasing empathy, we might be better off dismantling dyspathy. Because empathy is automatic at one level. That when we see other people suffering or in pain, we have an automatic reaction most of the time, and most of us, unless something stops it. So if we were to take away what stops it, we might do more for empathy than if we try to build it deliberately.
So it's kind of those blocks to empathy. You're saying there's this series of blocks to empathy. And if we want to enter the world of someone else, all we need to do is remove those blocks that are in the way. And we naturally are inclined, maybe biologically, to kind of draw closer to people just because of our biological nature.
Yeah.
And one of those blocks is fear. It sounds like you're saying. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. I've found various kinds, and very often they're motivated by fear. So that's probably because I'm looking at situations of violence and conflict, which of course will provoke fear in people. But there are also things like shame and anger, other emotions that would also block empathy. And then I've got a long list of things that block empathy.
Wow.
And I've grouped them together. So it's EMPS. So emotions is the first one. And then people's moral stance or moral commitments can also block empathy. So people say, no, that's just wrong to empathize with someone who's killed other people, for example. And so that works as a block. And then the P stands for the personal experiences that people have and what that does to their empathy. And the S for the social forces. So EMPS captures all the things I found that block empathy. And the social forces can be very strong. it's very hard to step out of your group norms and do something different from everyone else, for example.
Wow. So if we could kind of go through those kind of slowly. So the first one, yeah, because that's a lot for me to kind of take in. So you're saying fear is the first one.
I was saying emotions.
Oh, emotions in general.
Yeah. And fear is probably the strongest one I've come across.
So emotions in general, different emotions kind of get in the way, are like blocks.
Yes, they can be, yeah. One example I had when I've looked at police community interaction in Portland, Oregon, and I've done some work with Dr. David Ritchie, who works up there. And we were analysing this community meeting, and it started off with people intending empathy to happen. They wanted to listen to each other. They wanted to understand this tragic event of shooting of a young woman by the police. But it was a failure in terms of empathy, and we were analysing why. And one of the very strong things that came out was how people's emotions weren't acknowledged. So obviously the emotions of the family of the woman who'd been killed needed to be acknowledged, and of the community, but also of the police. The fact that the policeman might have been scared in the situation, it wasn't made possible for that to be acknowledged either. And so there was very little empathy with the police.
So you're saying acknowledgement of the emotions that are there. So to be sure, if we're kind of feeling our way into someone else's experience, we're needing to kind of consciously name the different feelings that are floating around.
Yeah, and that can be very difficult, of course. It's not easy. And Joe Berry and Patrick McGee, when he was the bomber who killed her father, when they were talking together, he acknowledged her grief, and he would say things like this. He was talking about her father being a target for the IRA back in the 80s, and how that was a cruel word to use. And so when he said to Joe, this is a cruel word to use, but your father was a target for us. By using that, he's acknowledging how she will feel what he's saying. So he's entering into her emotions, but he's also verbalizing it for her as well.
So we're talking about one of the ways to deepen empathy is to acknowledge the feelings that the other person has, or yourself. In that process, like I'm familiar with some circle processes or restorative justice processes, and one of those processes is reflective listening. So is you're talking to reflect back what the person is saying until they feel that you've thoroughly reflected back to their satisfaction what they've heard, what they've said.
Yeah. I can imagine that would be useful, and of course it takes a degree of self-awareness, doesn't it? Because you can't explain your emotions to someone else unless you've acknowledged them yourself. So
yeah, and sometimes just hearing the person trying to reflect your emotions kind of helps calm you down to allow you to go a little bit deeper, perhaps, something like that. Yeah.
But again, this idea that that empathy needs to be safe. And I think people often don't feel safe with emotions being expressed and shared and so on. So
a major quality in being able to go into someone's experience, kind of deepening that going into, is creating a sense of safety.
Exactly, yes.
Did you have insights about how do you create that sense of safety?
Well, the insights for there are coming from conflict transformation processes. And I'm working with an NGO who do conflict transformation and training. And they're very aware of creating safe spaces, both metaphorical spaces and real ones, and of bringing people from different sides of conflict. When they bring them together, they know they have to provide a physically safe space, but they also have to create a space for dialogue that feels safe as well. And I think, so I'm learning from how they do mediation. And I think that, I mean, the people who work in conflict transformation and mediation know a lot about creating safe spaces of that sort.
Yeah. So continuing, what were some other blocks that you came up with?
Okay, so the second set were the ones begin with M, the moral commitment. I'm only just bringing the ideas of morality into my work in the last few months. But I'm seeing it as important, and I like the work of Jonathan Haidt. You know, he's done this stuff on moral intuition and moral reasoning. And moral intuition is your automatic, instantaneous response, often driven by emotions. So these aren't independent. And moral reasoning is how you work things out in conversation or in your thoughts. And not instantaneously. And because I've looked at people talking, I've been able to see moral reasoning in practice and how people avoid empathy by doing moral reasoning. So some women in London were talking about, I think they were talking about human rights abuses in Afghanistan. This is some work with Bruna Sue at Birkbeck College in London. And they were saying, it's so far away, I can't imagine it. And that was part of their reasoning. And here you've got that distance metaphor, because, you know, it doesn't mean distance doesn't automatically mean you can't connect. You know, if we have relatives on the other side of the world, we can still empathize and imagine what it's like for them. And then they were also producing moral arguments like, I want to give charity at home and not far away. I've got so many issues here with my aunt or so on that I need to look after. And what they were doing in a group was this moral reasoning, and they were constructing reasons together why they didn't need to be concerned with what was happening far away. And then, so I can see that people's moral commitment can affect the way that they do empathy. And of course, on the other side of that is people who are morally committed to empathy, like Jo Berry. She thinks it's a really important thing to do. That affects everything she does and what she says and how she listens and so on. So it can work both ways.
Yeah. Well, you would think that moral, I mean, I'm a little unclear like what moral reasoning really is, because there is a morality says that I value empathy, and I'm trying to ground, you know, my morality on empathy, right? Mm-hmm. So there's maybe another morality that's kind of like a rules-based morality, or maybe, I don't know, it's almost like a fear-based morality, in the sense that the person is saying, I can't think of the others, I got to think of myself here. It means that they're stressed or you know what I mean? There's a bit of fear maybe underneath that.
Yeah. So emotions can drive people's moral reasoning, that's for sure. Yeah. What Haidt does is he has these 5 categories of morality, and so where people make they take a position. So they say something's right or wrong, or something's fair or unfair, or clean or dirty. And so I hear people talking about right and wrong and fair and unfair, and using that to justify why they shouldn't feel empathy. So in the project here in the UK, when we had focus groups talking about society and the risk of terrorism and so on, after we had our bombings here in 2007, one of the groups that was mentioned was this kind of collective refugees and asylum seekers. And this is a group in the UK that isn't really a group at all. They're people coming from very different situations, but they tend to get lumped together, especially when people are doing fairly negative moral reasoning. And there are sort of myths, cultural myths about it. So someone in one of the groups was saying, well, these people come as asylum seekers and they get a car and they get a house and they get some money. And this is one of the stories that the media exaggerates and as isn't exactly true. And if you manage to get through the very long process of being an asylum seeker and being granted asylum, you get a very small amount of money. So what they're saying is not literally true, but they're using it in this moral reasoning to say it's not fair, and that it's not fair works to block any empathy with the group.
Well, I do have some thoughts about that in the sense that you just described the reasoning that these people have about asylum seekers, and what I see that happens a lot is that someone will say, well, these asylum seekers, they're getting all the money and they're living, here they called it welfare queens, driving their Cadillacs and they're getting welfare. And then what happens is people will say, no, that's not true. And then as soon as the person's feeling or whatever is underneath that is discounted, then it just gets accentuated. Right. So what I found is I talked to a really wide variety of people, and I try to have been finding how to really talk to them about empathy. So instead of saying, no, you're not correct about the asylum seekers getting all this, you're saying you're really concerned. It's like hearing what it is that their concerns are, and there's some kind of a fear there that they have. And
emotions again.
It's emotions, and then so it's that fear, and it's the fear that that they're being taken advantage of in a sense. And it's like, oh, these people, I'm working hard, and it's actually a fear that they're not being empathized with by the asylum seeker. So, it was just, I did that here with, at a convention where people were talking about their fears. I listened to what their fears were, and then, and their value was protection. We're going to protect ourselves. And it was by listening to their fears and then acknowledging the fears, seeing how the fears related to a sense of wanting security, and then, saying, how does that relate to empathy? You're afraid that those people are not going to empathize with you. And they said, yeah, that's right. And then the dialogue actually became about how do we deepen empathy. So, what do you think?
I like that. It resonates again with the conflict transformation model. They call it the PIN model, where it's like icebergs. So at the top of people's positions, and they'll have very strong positions and opposite positions. But if you go underneath that, you find it's about identity. And then if you dig even deeper, it's about needs. And that's where you're at the protection and the fear level. And often it overlaps at the need level, so that both the asylum seeker and the people objecting to them will share those human needs. And if you can drill down to that level, then you find a space where people can connect.
Oh, there's another metaphor for your the drilling down. Empathy is drilling down. It's getting out the drilling equipment. Empathy is like getting out the drilling equipment.
Maybe we need something a bit gentler. But I think what's happening there is this dyspathy again. Is what you're doing is dismantling it. When you do something like that, you unpack what's in the way, and then the empathy can thrive, or at least be possible.
Yeah, we need to drill down to that empathy and kind of get all the dirt and all the stuff that's in the way of the oil of empathy. So that's it. So what was the next component?
So the next one was P for personal experience. So we had EMP. You'll notice the connection. So the personal experience was, again, it's going to link to morality and to emotions, isn't it? But if you've lost someone in a bombing, that's going to affect how you are. But on the other hand, if your personality is such that you don't want to make a distinction between goodies and baddies, which is Joe Berry's words. You want to understand the other person, then your personal experience will be outweighed by your personal determination. So I think we have to look carefully at what people as individuals have experienced and how that's affected them. And then the fourth one was the social...
Can we go into that a little bit? So you're saying if someone's had a bad experience, that's kind of like still resonant with them from... yeah, I know, for example, it's like if I've had an accident. I mean, I've had like where I've had, somebody ran into me or somebody kind of attacked me out here on the bike trail that we have, that feeling remains resident. I can feel this level of distrust. And so it's kind of those type of experiences that have kind of like built up and are still like unresolved. Is that what you're meaning? Right.
That's what I mean, exactly. That's a very good, very helpful example, because when you come into contact with something that activates that memory, then those emotions are going to be activated along with the memory. So even if I don't know, it's the same weather as the day you were attacked, that might be enough to bring those emotions back. And that.
Okay, so yeah, the call just dropped out, and I think the connection just went bad. So you were talking about the Afghan. There was a story about some Afghans.
Oh yes, it was about how your personal experience can affect your empathy. So I was back with this group of women in London who were asked to think about people in faraway countries like Afghanistan and how they might be suffering. And when they were doing their reasoning about this, they brought up their personal experiences. And their personal experiences of people asking for money on the streets. So I don't know if it's the same where you are, but in London, there are quite often women with children who are begging and will come up to you and ask for money. And the coming up, the words they use, they come up to you, was suggesting the threat that they feel emotionally. And then they would apply this more metaphorically to charities who ask for your name and address and keep sending you requests for money. So they were coming up to you, but in a more metaphorical way. And again, this became a reason then for them not to want to give to charities. So it seems that there's the personal experience, and if that's a negative experience, there are negative emotions that get attached to the memories. And then when those are activated, they can block empathy.
And did you, so there's another block, just those past memories, and they get associated with different events, or it seems like they can even get transferred from, transferred from one community to the other. And how do you overcome those blocks? I mean, did you have insights about that type of block?
Well, it seems to be personal connection that will overcome those. So if somebody knows someone from Afghanistan, then they can disregard what might otherwise be a block. So personal connections come across as really strongly as being important, not just for that one-to-one, but for connecting with other people from the same group. So again, in the UK, when we had the terrorist attacks in 2007, they were carried out by young Muslim men from Britain. And there was inevitably some backlash and suspicion on members of the Muslim community. But what prevented that was people's personal connections and friendships across the Muslim, non-Muslim boundary, as it were.
So to overcome that block, we're just needing to create environments where there's more personal connections with different.
Yeah, and I think that the arts have a lot to offer. I think, television documentaries, even reality shows, that let you understand another community and how it is to live there, they stand in for that personal connection if you can't make friends in other communities. I think film and fiction, I have a student looking at the effect of reading novels and whether that can make a difference to people's empathy. So yeah, I think we have to look at the more personal connections, the better, if they're really physically personal, but otherwise it's a matter of making do with what the arts have to offer.
Is it second best then?
Yeah.
Okay, so that was number 3, kind of block number 3.
Yeah. And then number 4 is the social forces. So the belonging to a group and how that can make you reluctant to empathize if it's not acceptable by your group to do so.
So something about like groups kind of form into gangs in a sense, right? And there's kind of like, how do you maintain the cohesion within the gang? And it's like, it's kind of like this enforcement of in-group, out-group kind of.
That's right. And the group dictates what's appropriate to do and who you connect with and how. So I think that can have a very big effect.
And ideas for overcoming that block?
That's an interesting one, isn't it? What the most recent work I've been doing is in Kenya, and I just come back from a week or two there, and it was fascinating. We're in the North Rift Valley, where there are 3 tribes of pastoralists. So they live by keeping cattle and goats, and there's always been a history of cattle raiding, but in the last few years it got very violent because of arms dealing, and people were protecting themselves with guns. And so they had a lot of killing, and in the Roman Catholic Church up there, they've started doing peacemaking projects, and that's what we were visiting with this NGO responding to conflict. And we met an amazing man up there who's working in the church and leading these peace building projects. And I was very struck by one of the things he does, because the conflict is across tribes. So they'll talk about members of the other tribe as enemies, as this lumping into a category of enemy. And there are very tight cultural controls on how you act as a member of a tribe, depending what age group you're in. And he was using every opportunity he could to dismantle some of these things, these social forces. And one of them was painting pictures for people. So if you like, he was scaffolding them into a vision of the future. And he would do this both positively and negatively. So he would try to make them, these young men with guns, he would try to make them aware of how bad things would be if they continued. And for example, he'd shown them films like Hotel Rwanda, about the genocide in Rwanda, and saying, look how bad it got in Rwanda, and here we are in Kenya, we don't want it to be so bad. And he'd say, if you go and take revenge now for some killing, that's not the end of it. There'll be more revenge. So he was really emphasizing how bad things could get. And that was one way he was trying to make them think. And to not just react immediately as a member of that tribe who should revenge a killing. And the other thing he did was paint positive pictures. So he'd say, look, if you don't use the guns, if we stop fighting, then you can grow crops, and then we can have school for the children. And he was painting a picture of a good life that was the alternative. And it struck me as a kind of really important leadership that he was doing in empathy there, that because they were in the heat of the conflict, what he could do was step in and hold for them these visions, both the negative and the positive, so that he gave them time to think, but he also gave them alternatives to think about. And it seemed to me that's something very important, and I think that would work in other societies and groups as well. So I'm quite interested. Sorry.
Oh no, just to have a vision of like if we're in conflict, this is a vision of how bad things will get, and this is the alternative, and you have like the choice to.
Yeah. Yeah, and it needs someone who can stand a bit outside of the conflict and the immediacy of it to do that for people. And I think that's a really important part of leadership for empathy.
Well, there's another part, I think it's a bit of kind of the vision that I have for the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy, is to push for the culture, for the national broad culture, to explicitly say that empathy is our value and to actively advocate and work towards that. Mm-hmm. So for here in the United States, for example, we have corporations who are told corporations are for pure self-interest and maximizing profit. So you create a national narrative of self-interest.
Yeah.
And when somebody's in a conflict, they remember, oh, this is all about self-interest because that's what the national narrative says. And then it's all about, I have to protect myself. But if there's a national conscious effort to say empathy is a value, then it gives something to kind of reference back to.
I'm interested there, if I can ask you a question then. Does empathy equate with compassion? Because for me, I'm never quite sure whether you can have something like a value-free empathy, in the sense that you can understand someone who did something really bad, but it doesn't mean you agree with it. You have to somehow accept it or just hold it in your head.
Yeah, the negativity that the pain that they caused, and
so it's it's what Halpern and Weinstein, that in their paper on empathy, they call it emotional ambivalence that you have to deal with.
Well,
that empathy is not easy, is it?
Yeah, I have I've been looking at trying to define empathy as well, and I've seen empathy as like 4 parts, and it's not that they build on each other, it's more like a wheel, in the sense that the first part is self-empathy, so self-awareness, mindfulness of what's going on in my own body as a felt experience. And if I'm very fearful, my awareness kind of closes down, and the more relaxed, open I get, the more I'm able to take in from the outside. And then the second part would be mirrored empathy, and that's what the academics are, what I'm seeing, are calling emotional empathy or emotional contagion, and that's based on mirror neurons. So as I'm seeing you, there's this interaction from your voice. I'm hearing the quality of your voice, and I'm mirroring that in myself. I'm seeing your physical motions, I'm mirroring that. And that allows me to kind of see who you are and to feel kind of what's going on inside of yourself. And then the third part is what I call imaginative empathy, or perspective taking, cognitive empathy. And that's where I kind of see that as coming from self-awareness, as the child with child development, as we hit a certain age, 18 months, we can start recognizing ourselves in the mirror and realize that we're separate entities, that we have our different perspectives. And there's all kinds of tests that show how this works that I've seen, that we can take the perspective of someone. So it has a bit more of a cognitive, mixed in, kind of like an actor would. You tell an actor, you've lost all your money and you're homeless. What does it feel like? And you just take on that role. And then
that's the entering into, yes.
The what?
The entering into.
The entering into part. Even though the mirroring is very much entering into as well. It's just kind of like a little different part of the brain, maybe. Yeah. And then the fourth part is empathic action. And that is, and I've seen that play out, especially in mediation, where 2 people are disputants. They hate each other. You get all this process. They start understanding each other, and then they start taking action together. It's like, what do we do now? And it's that you've seen that harmony. People start kind of negotiating and kind of working together, and they're aware of how their feelings and thoughts will affect their actions, will affect others. And so it adds an action component to kind of a transformation or creating of our new social structure and relationship. So, and those I see as kind of like on a wheel that kind of they overlap and interact. So with that model, it's like the question was about compassion. What is compassion? How does that relate? And for me, the compassion part is that process applied to suffering. It's like when we see now I'm looking at you, I don't notice any suffering, so I'm kind of empathizing with your feelings, your happiness, your exploration. And if I saw you feeling suffering, it's like, how would my empathic interaction go with suffering? And there tends to be this component of alleviating suffering, when maybe, I want to alleviate your suffering. So that's kind of the basic model. I don't know how that kind of fits in with the model you've been developing.
Yeah, because it fits in fairly well. I mean, you have the idea of the wheel and going around, and I have the dynamics that I'm trying to build into mine. And the two parts, the automatic and empathy, that's more emotional, and then this more deliberative, rational kind of empathy, the perspective taking, I have both of those. Yeah.
Is your emotional empathy like based on the mirror neurons, the mirroring kind of? It's like that's the biological function of that mirroring. And
it's instant and immediate, whereas the other type, the perspective taking, takes longer cognitively to do. Yeah, I think I have both of those, and I can see both of those happening in dialogue, because that's where I start from, is people talking to each other. So you can see both of those going on. And sometimes you can see the action, but sometimes I don't have access to the action. So I talk about what emerges from a dialogue, and that might be a shift in how people see each other. So they might say, I no longer see you as just a perpetrator. I see you as a human being. Or
yeah, that last part, I've heard it defined as empathy being when the blocks to action are removed that don't exclude. So we know it even when we're working with colleagues, is we kind of agree to something, and then you start going, and something's just not working in our actions. And it kind of comes because somebody hasn't been heard about something that's important to them. And then once that kind of gets aired and you kind of feel each other, that then the action can be kind of more kind of harmonious. And I actually kind of got this from Dominic Barter, who does restorative justice process in Brazil. And he was just talking about doing these workshops where he said, people would come in, like this one woman came in and she said, well, my boyfriend, he's, I'm washing the dishes. He's laying on the sofa watching TV. He's just not helping out, and I'm totally pissed off at him. And she's really mad and irritated. And everybody in the group, was an empathy group, kind of listens. Oh, you're really mad. You're really irritated. And, she feels heard. She's seen and has that empathic connection, which is, the oxytocin level goes up and she feels calmer. She feels more satisfied. And then she goes home, and then next week, he said, the next workshop, the same thing happens. My boyfriend, whatever. And then she feels heard, she feels better. And then he said, well, the third time, it's like, I don't know what's going to happen here. And she comes back, and sure enough, it's the same thing. So the transformation didn't really happen between her and her boyfriend. And that's where the action kind of component of empathy happens, where if the two of them sit down, have that dialogue, have that connection, and then work out how they're going to deal with washing the dishes, I mean, at the most simple, level that we're all dealing with here at our homes.
Yeah. So. Yeah. And it reminds me of the ideas of Charles Dickens, when he wrote his novels, and he had the poor hungry children in there, and people with problems that he tried to portray, but he really wanted altruism to result. He wanted action. And although they didn't use the word empathy in those days, he was trying to create empathy through his novels so that people would, give their money to the orphanages or the soup kitchens or whatever.
Yeah. So he was trying to stimulate empathy within society through his artwork by revealing, sharing those stories.
Yeah, letting people experience and make the connection. Because those mirror neurons probably work when you read something as well, or they certainly work when you watch something. That's how they first found them activated, wasn't it?
Yeah. So how is your work developing? How do you see it progressing, and where do you want to go from here?
I have to go into writing up phase because that's what grant bodies require. So I have to write some more papers, and I want to write a book about it. But there are issues coming out that I want to take further. So one is this idea of safe spaces for empathy. I really would like to talk some more with architects, for example, about how they, or whether they think about designing spaces with connecting people in mind. I also am getting intrigued by this idea of moral leadership, because it seems to me, I mean, you talked about national values being empathy. That's not going to happen unless some leaders work at that level to make it happen. It seems because empathy is quite difficult and it's very easy to block it, it seems to me we could do with some leadership. And when I was in Kenya and I was watching this guy, Evans Onyego, I could see moral leadership at work there. So I would really like to investigate that some more and see how people, as in leadership roles, how they support empathy and help it to happen.
So those are the two areas you're really still wanting to explore. Are there more areas, or those are the main ones?
Those are the main ones at the moment, yes.
And then write it all up, and then do this conference as well. What's the overview of what the conference is about?
Yeah, we're having two separate days. So the first one's for academics, for anybody who's researching empathy. So I'm hoping to get along some people from medical world, because there's been a lot of work on empathy by academics in medicine. And I haven't really touched that much, but I'm quite interested in how they can turn empathy off in order to survive as a medic. And yet they must feel empathy and compassion in order to be one in the first place. So I think they must be quite expert at controlling empathy. So the first day of the conference is for researchers of various sorts in empathy. And then the second day, what I'm hoping is to get together policymakers and professionals and practitioners, so people from conflict transformation and from restorative justice and so on, so that I can discuss findings with them and turn it into real useful applications out there in the real world.
How's that going, getting people lined up for that?
Yeah, I've got a few on board already, and lots of invitations are out there. And if anyone wants to come, they can, the flyers are on the website, so all the information's there.
Well, I really am interested. I'm interested in both of those parts, and especially on the second part, which seems to overlap with. You're looking at leaders, like how do leaders promote empathy? And in the United States, Barack Obama talked quite a bit about empathy, and that was one of the inspirations for me to kind of explore it in more depth. But I'm also seeing the need for a movement to be built behind it. So, for a leader, it's like. To get up there and say, we need more empathy. I think unless there's a ground, grassroots movement to support that effort, that it's not going to go far, because people say, oh yeah, that sounds great. But
and I suppose it's people like us who can show how empathy might make a difference in the whole range of situations. And equip people who already are leaders. So I'm thinking politicians, but there are also other kinds of leaders out there. But so they already have a leadership role, but do they know what empathy can contribute to that role and how it can make a difference?
Well, I have a great example of that, because here in the United States, Barack Obama said that he was going to choose a Supreme Court justice, and one of the qualities was going to be empathy. And,
I remember.
Oh, and all hell broke loose, and it's been an ongoing debate, and I have it all tracked on my website. I don't know if you've seen that, but empathy was mentioned over 500 times, and just going back and forth how horrible empathy is and how it means this, it means that, and there was just a lack of clarity about the whole definition of empathy. And from my sense, the Democrats, progressives, or whoever were not. There was no articulation and explanation of it. So the whole thing is just mired in misunderstanding, confusion between the definition of empathy and sympathy. They're used interchangeably. So it was a total mess. And I was just seeing a need for maybe doing some panel discussions with, people like yourself to go through the different points that they're bringing up and actually address them in a panel discussion, so that the policymakers can actually have some kind of a scientific and academic and experiential reference to kind of guide what they're talking about.
Yeah, that would be good.
Yeah, so I would just invite you to be part of that. That's something I'm hoping to set up. And so in terms of creating this movement, do you have ideas about creating a movement? You're kind of doing it just by your research, and you're bringing people together. Do you have other ideas of like empathy movement building?
No, I hadn't thought in terms of movements. I don't know. I'm a bit wary of movements, I have to say, but I suppose I'm interested to go out there and help people already doing things. So, although even that sounds dangerous to me, because I always learn more than I think I can teach. But anyway, so working with conflict transformation people at the moment is really giving me a lot. And they have very scientific models of how they do their transformation. And I think what I can offer there is kind of the human level about how people connect one-to-one. And so I hope I can make a difference that way.
I'm just curious. I'm hearing some real concern about movements, and I'm hearing some blocks to movements.
Yeah. Well, you would have heard it when I was talking about social forces and how becoming part of a group or a movement can be limiting, because you're kind of normed, aren't you? When you have to accept certain ways of acting and being and thinking if you join a group. So
you like to kind of remain detached from any kind of group and any involvement and commitment to a group, because it's
well, they're not completely detached. I have my Goldilocks principle of empathy, and I have my Goldilocks principle, I suppose, of life, which is not too close and not too far away, but just at the right distance.
So is the empathy, but empathy is kind of like going into, right? It's like how deep of empathy do you want in your own life? Like what? What's that?
Well, I think it comes back to this idea of being too close as being threatening, and I don't mean that talking. We get into the psychotherapy of my life, but I think there's a limit to how much human beings, rather than me individually, how much closeness people can deal with. So, I mean, maybe that can be adjusted culturally.
Yeah, well, you're talking about emotional closeness and empathy. It's like, in a sense, you're almost like saying there's a limit to our empathy. I mean, how much empathy we can handle. Maybe.
Would you not think so? Maybe when we're on the perspective taking, it's easier to imagine it stretching. I mean, you can do perspective taking with many, many people, I'm sure.
Yeah, well,
So I don't see limits to that.
well, one part from myself with the perspective taking is kind of seeing yourself as an individual being, and sometimes that can kind of feel threatened, you know, by this emotional empathy. Like you get so overwhelmed, and some people I've talked to, it's like emotional empathy. Well, they're concerned about their sense of limits and boundaries. And even growing up, they didn't have a sense of boundaries, or their boundaries were through trauma or abuse, were kind of overwhelmed. So they have real trouble with, I mean, they're focused on the boundary and the empathy, you know. So, I mean, there's a lot more we can kind of explore around. I mean, there's so much to explore around this, and
yeah, and I think, I mean, the self-empathy, I think, is really interesting and very under-investigated, and I think people who are self-aware are the ones who can do empathy. But there's also this notion of psychic numbing. I don't know if you've come across that, which is that's Slovich, where he's looking at, some other people called it the collapse of compassion, is when you're exposed to too much suffering and too much demand on empathy, then it seems to collapse. So there's a lot of interesting stuff going on there, I think.
Well, this is, how long are you going to keep working on this? Is this an ongoing project, or are you going to have a limit?
The money runs out, unfortunately. The money runs out in September, but I'm hoping to get some more. So we'll
good.
See.
Because then we can keep exploring this, because this is a lifelong quest for me. So in terms of building kind of a movement and support, you know, social support for this, I see one thing that's come up a lot is people say, just create a dialogue, keep talking about it, bringing up, just like we're doing. So that's kind of what my dialogues are about, is just let's bring it up as a social topic and start talking about it.
Yeah.
And the second thing I'm seeing is people who are working in the empathy field, and to start networking more, to get more connected now through Skype and so forth. We have that chance to do that. So.
Yeah, well, you're doing a good job. That's,
well, thanks.
Great.
And you're doing a good job too. And I just I hope we can perhaps do some online panel discussions too. If you're interested in doing like a pre-panel or some post-panels to your conference, I would invite you to do that. And perhaps we can do some future dialogues going into more depth. Because I saw you had like a slideshow there too. Maybe we could go through that at some point or something.
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay.
I'll be in the States in October, end of October. Yeah.
California or
Connecticut.
Oh, okay. It's a long ways from me here. Well, great. One last question. What's your most important value?
Personally, or in my research?
Personally, yeah, personally.
Oh, that's not an easy question to answer, just off the top of my head. Integrity, I suppose.
Okay, well, we'll do another talk sometime on the relationship of integrity and empathy. That's my partner's most important value too. Joan, is integrity. So that's another project they have, is wanting to take all these different values: integrity, compassion, peace, justice, and then relate them to empathy. Like, how do they relate? So I think that'll be it. Anyway, I could keep going and going. So I know we've been going for about an hour here, so I don't want to keep you over our time. Yeah.
I've been very fast, so thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Lynne. It's a real pleasure.
Yes, pleasure. Okay. Pleasure talking to you.
Bye.
Bye.
See the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.